Ashley Floor, and you know what I'm talking about here on my channel right now.
The moment this update dropped, it didn't just feel like another routine legal development, it felt like the kind of shift that quietly changes the entire direction of a case. And if you were tuning into Coravanta that day, you already knew something serious was unfolding. Lars Harry opened the conversation with a tone that wasn't rushed or overly dramatic, but there was weight behind it. The kind of weight that tells you this isn't just noise, this matters. What he laid out right at the start was simple on the surface but huge in implication. The judge had just knocked out 10 out of 13 claims that Blake Lively had brought against Justin Baldoni. Not trimmed. Not softened. Removed. And suddenly, everything people thought this case was about started to feel less certain. Now, depending on which side you were listening to, the reaction couldn't have been more different. On one end, Lively's side tried to frame it as something procedural, almost like a bump in the road, something technical, something that didn't really touch the heart of her accusations. But Baldoni's side? They treated it like a major breakthrough. To them, this wasn't just a reduction, it was validation. It suggested that a large portion of what had been alleged didn't even meet the threshold to be argued in front of a jury. And that's where the confusion for the public really started. Because when you hear claims dismissed, it sounds decisive. But when you hear technical reasons, it sounds like something slipped through a loophole. And most people aren't legal experts, they're just trying to figure out who's actually winning here. So Lars Harry did what he does best, he brought in someone who could break that down without turning it into jargon. A legal analyst with decades of experience, someone who has seen cases rise, fall, and collapse under pressure. And right away, the tone of the conversation shifted from speculation to clarity. Not emotional clarity, but structural clarity. The kind that forces you to look at the mechanics of what just happened. The first thing that stood out was just how significant that number really is. 10 out of 13. That's not a small adjustment. That's the majority of the case being stripped away in one move. And according to the analysis, this wasn't random or rushed. The judge didn't just skim through arguments and make a quick call. This was a 150-plus page decision, detailed, methodical, and very intentional. Every claim was examined, every argument weighed, and the conclusion was surprisingly narrow. Only a small portion of this case actually belongs in front of a jury, and here's where things took a turn that a lot of people didn't expect. The claims that most people associated with this case, the ones that carried the most emotional and public weight, weren't the ones that survived. The sexual harassment allegations, which had shaped the public narrative from the beginning, were no longer part of the legal battlefield. Gone. What remained instead were retaliation claims, which are far more complex and, in many ways, harder to prove in a clean, direct way. That shift alone changes how this case is understood. Because when a case moves from something like harassment to retaliation, the focus moves away from what happened to why something happened afterward. It becomes about cause and effect. Motivation. Timeline. And suddenly, the story isn't as simple as accusation versus denial anymore. It becomes layered, almost like trying to reconstruct a chain reaction where every link has to be proven. As the conversation continued, Lars Harry leaned into something that a lot of viewers don't usually think about, the process behind a judge's decision. People often imagine a judge just reading documents and making a call, but the reality is far more structured. Especially at the federal level, where the workload is massive and the stakes are high. There are teams involved, law clerks, researchers, legal assistants, people who organize arguments, verify case law, and essentially build the framework that allows a judge to make an informed decision. But what stood out here wasn't just the system, it was the preparation. From what was described, this judge didn't walk into this blindly. He had already engaged deeply with the material months earlier. He asked sharp, targeted questions. The kind of questions that reveal not just familiarity, but understanding. And when those same themes appeared again in the final ruling, it became clear this wasn't reactive, it was deliberate. Then the conversation moved into something more unusual, something that makes this case feel very modern, the role of the internet. Not just as an audience, but as a participant. There were mentions of online communities analyzing metadata, uncovering details, even sending information directly to legal teams. In older cases, that kind of crowdsourced involvement simply didn't exist. But here, it's part of the ecosystem, and that raises an uncomfortable but important question: where's the line between public discussion and legal influence? Because when content creators, viewers, and independent analysts start feeding information into a case, it creates a feedback loop. One where the narrative isn't just shaped by lawyers and evidence, but by public interpretation as well. At the same time, the accusations around that involvement added another layer. Lively's side had suggested coordination between Baldoni's legal team and online voices. But when that was unpacked, the reality seemed less dramatic than the accusation. Yes, there were connections, some outreach, some communication, but not at the scale being implied. And that gap between claim and evidence is exactly the kind of thing that gets tested under pressure, especially if this ever reaches a jury. From there, the focus shifted to one of the most critical elements in any retaliation case: timing. Because retaliation isn't just about something negative happening, it's about that thing happening because of something else. There has to be a clear sequence. A protected action, followed by a response. Cause leading to effect, and this is where things get complicated for Lively's position. Because if negative perceptions, criticism, or public narratives existed before the alleged trigger point, then the argument starts to weaken. You can't retroactively assign cause to something that already existed. And when you're dealing with a public figure, someone who has been in the spotlight for years, that timeline becomes even harder to control. Lars Harry touched on this in a way that felt grounded in reality. Celebrities don't exist in a vacuum. Every interview, every appearance, every past moment can resurface at any time. And when they do, they become part of the narrative whether you want them to or not. So proving that a specific shift in public perception was caused by a specific action? That's not just difficult, it's one of the hardest things to isolate in a case like this. What made the discussion even more interesting was how the legal perspective evolved over time. Early on, there was skepticism about the strength of the case, particularly the retaliation angle. But as more details emerged, especially around the legal standards being applied, that perspective shifted slightly. Not completely, but enough to recognize that under certain laws, particularly at the state level, the threshold for proving retaliation isn't as strict as it is federally, and that nuance matters. Because it means a case that might fail in one legal framework could survive in another. It doesn't guarantee success, but it changes the playing field. Still, even with that adjustment, the uphill nature of the case remained. Because at its core, this isn't just about legal definitions, it's about perception, history, and influence. And when those factors are spread out over years, across media, interviews, and public appearances, narrowing them down into a single cause becomes incredibly difficult. By the time this part of the conversation settled, one thing was clear: this case is no longer what people thought it was at the beginning. It's smaller, sharper, and in some ways, more unpredictable. The emotional weight might still be there in public discussion, but legally, the structure has changed, and with the trial date slowly approaching, the real question isn't just what happened in the past, it's what can actually be proven moving forward. As the conversation pushed forward, it started to move away from just what the judge decided, and into something that often matters just as much in high-profile cases like this: the narrative outside the courtroom. Because while legal arguments shape the outcome, public perception shapes everything around it. Careers, reputations, future opportunities, all of that lives in the space where law and image collide, and this is where Lars Harry leaned into a reality that doesn't get talked about enough. Even if someone wins illegally, that doesn't automatically translate into a real-world comeback. Especially in Hollywood. Because the industry doesn't operate like a courtroom. It operates on risk. And once someone is seen as risky, whether that perception is fair or not, doors start closing quietly. In this situation, Baldoni's position becomes complicated. Because even in a scenario where he clears major legal hurdles, the question remains: who's willing to take that chance on him again? Studios don't just look at verdicts, they look at headlines, audience reactions, and long-term brand impact. And when a controversy reaches this level of visibility, it doesn't just disappear when a case ends. It lingers. At the same time, Lively's position isn't exactly simple either. Because losing the bulk of her claims, especially the ones that shape the public story, creates a different kind of pressure. Not just legally, but narratively. And that's where strategy starts to matter in a different way. There was a moment in the discussion where Lars Harry explored something that might seem counterintuitive at first, the idea that, in some ways, having certain claims dismissed could actually be useful from a public standpoint. Not because it strengthens the case legally, but because it allows for a shift in messaging. Instead of defending those claims in court, they can now be reframed outside of it, positioned as something that wasn't heard, rather than something that didn't hold up, and that's a powerful distinction in the world of PR. Because to the public, there's a big difference between this didn't happen and this wasn't allowed to be argued. Even if, legally, the reasoning is far more detailed and substantive, this led directly into one of the most debated narratives surrounding the case, the idea that Baldoni's legal win was somehow just a technicality. And this is where the legal perspective pushed back hard. Because in reality, the law is technical by nature. Every decision is built on definitions, standards, thresholds, and frameworks. That's not a loophole, that's the system working the way it's designed to. What people often label as a technicality is usually just a misunderstanding of how precise the law actually is. And in this case, the judge didn't sidestep the issues, he addressed them in detail. Especially when it came to the structure of the working relationship, which played a major role in how the claims were evaluated. That's where the conversation circled back to one of the most ironic and impactful elements of the entire case, the issue of power, because at the heart of many workplace-related claims, especially those involving harassment or discrimination, is the concept of imbalance. One person having authority over another. One side being vulnerable. That imbalance is what allows certain legal protections to apply, but here, the conclusion pointed in the opposite direction. The argument wasn't that Lively lacked credibility, it was that she lacked vulnerability in the legal sense. That her level of influence, control, and involvement placed her outside the category those laws are designed to protect, and that's where the producer credit issue became more than just a side detail, it became central. Because pushing for that level of authority and recognition may have strengthened her position professionally, but at the same time, it undercut the legal framework needed to support certain claims. It's a contradiction that's hard to ignore. On one hand, asserting power and control. On the other, needing to demonstrate a lack of it. And the law doesn't easily allow both to exist at the same time. From there, the discussion shifted into the PR contrast between both sides, and it couldn't have been more different. Baldoni's approach, at least publicly, has been noticeably quiet. Controlled. Minimal. While Lively's side has continued to engage more directly, highlighting specific parts of the ruling and shaping the message in a very targeted way, but that selective framing didn't go unnoticed. Because when only certain parts of a decision are emphasized, especially in a case this detailed, it creates a version of the story that isn't entirely complete. And over time, that can start to raise questions. Not just about what's being said, but about what's being left out. There was also an interesting layer of speculation introduced about who's actually driving the strategy behind the scenes. While nothing was presented as fact, there was a sense that the tone and style of the messaging had a very specific fingerprint. And when narratives feel consistent in personality, people naturally start wondering where that influence is coming from. Then came the question that always lingers in cases like this, settlement. At first glance, it seemed like there might be movement in that direction. Reports started circulating about renewed discussions, possible shifts in position. But once that was broken down, it became clear that this wasn't necessarily coming from either party directly. It was procedural. A standard step following a major ruling that changes the scope of a case, and that makes sense. Because the case that exists now is not the same case that existed before. Fewer claims. Different focus. Different risks. So naturally, the conversation around resolution gets revisited, but here's where things become unpredictable again. Because settlement isn't just about numbers, it's about motivation. And in this situation, money might not be the primary driver, at least for one side. If the goal is reputation, vindication, or clearing a name, then a financial agreement doesn't necessarily solve that, and that's what makes this feel like it's still on a path toward trial. Not guaranteed, but possible in a way that wasn't as clear before. When Lars Harry pushed for a percentage, an actual estimate of how likely a trial is, the answer landed right in the middle. 50%. And while that might sound uncertain, it actually reflects the reality of where things stand. Because the next phase of this case isn't about broad arguments anymore, it's about precision. Pre-trial motions are where cases quietly transform. Evidence gets included or excluded. Arguments get narrowed. Entire strategies get reshaped based on what's allowed to be presented in front of a jury. And sometimes, those decisions don't just influence the trial, they determine whether a trial is even worth pursuing. One example stood out in particular: damages. Because when you remove certain claims, you don't just remove arguments, you remove potential outcomes. And if the scope of damages shrinks enough, it changes the entire risk-reward calculation. Another major factor is evidence. Especially anything tied to external reporting, third-party documents, or materials that may not meet strict admissibility standards. If key pieces of narrative can't be shown to a jury, the story being told in court becomes very different from the one the public has been following, and that gap between public narrative and courtroom reality is where many high-profile cases either gain clarity or completely fall apart. As the conversation started to wind down, the focus shifted briefly to something more practical, almost ironic given the scale of everything being discussed: scheduling. Because while the public sees headlines and arguments, the people involved are still dealing with calendars, timelines, and the unpredictability of court decisions. Trial dates aren't just dates, they're moving targets. And until everything is finalized at the pre-trial stage, nothing is truly locked in. But beneath that lighter moment, the core takeaway remained the same. This case has evolved. What started as a broad, emotionally charged legal battle has been narrowed into something more technical, more focused, and in many ways, more uncertain. And maybe the most interesting part of all of this is what it's done outside the courtroom. Because through conversations like this, through breakdowns, debates, and analysis, people who never paid attention to legal processes before are now understanding how these systems actually work. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to ask better questions. And in a case where so much depends on interpretation, of facts, of timelines, of intent, that might end up being just as important as the final verdict.